أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Welcome to this brand new show on Ahlul Bayt TV, The Struggle Within. A show that is going to look at various different topics, various different elements of the religion that are sometimes not always given the credence or the importance that they actually deserve. Topics that are sometimes covered in various different shows, in various different elements, but not centrally as a central theme on the channel, something that we want to look at going into 2015. I have to begin with introducing my guest. Assalamu alaikum. Grant Waslaka, who has taken the time out. Thank you very much for giving us that time, this opportunity, of course. Well, I thank you on behalf of the channel. Before we begin, the central theme, or one of the central themes that surround this topic, is a hadith that is narrated from an individual who relates it al-Sukni, on the authority of Abu Abdullah al-Sadiq. Verily, on seeing the returning armies from the battlefront, the Prophet of God said, "Blessed are those who have performed the minor jihad and have yet to perform the major one." When asked what is the major jihad, the Prophet replied, "The jihad of the self." This is where we have coined the phrase, the struggle within. We just want to look at what is this greater jihad. We often hear the word jihad being used a lot in the media today, the idea of the minor jihad. What is this greater jihad that the Prophet was then saying that, listen, when you get back from the battle, you now have to start the greater struggle, the struggle that is within. What is that? How does this process take place?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate. All praises to Allah, the Creator of the universes and their Sustainer, the Provider of believers and non-believers. And may His choicest blessings be on the seed of His prophets, the last of His messengers, and His holy progeny. The question you raise comes from the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, in relation to what is generally referred to as Jihadul Akbar, the greater jihad, the struggle within for the purification, indeed ultimately the perfection of a human being, our journey of personal development, such that the mission of Islam, as the Holy Prophet taught it, was about making each of us better than we were yesterday, and tomorrow, inshallah, being better than we are today. So that there is a constant journey of improvement, of purification, and ultimately of perfection in our connection with divinity and the manifestation of the attributes of a believer. And this is where the idea of the greater jihad, of Jihad al-Akbar, is entirely connected to the principles of akhlaq, the principles of character development and our practical psychology within the Islamic teachings. What in modern days we call personal development. And the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and his holy progeny was very clear about this being the central tenet of what Islam is. We have the famous hadith, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِيُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. Surely I have been sent. So this primary purpose for being sent is makarim al-akhlaq, for the perfection of character, of human character. And this is a hadith that is so important that we find it across the Islamic tradition. We see it in Shia works such as Mustadrak al-Wasail. We see it in various Sunni works of hadith, including in the Sahih Sitta, the Sunan by Nasa'i has it, various other sources have it as well. Why is this important? Well, it locates the subject of akhlaq at the center of the Islamic message. And it also shows that actually when the Holy Prophet was talking about the greater jihad, the inner struggle of self-purification, this is the context of akhlaq. And when we look at what it is and how it works and why it's so important, we see it discussed across the Islamic teachings, including in the Holy Quran. And one of the key principles of this battle within is firstly to realize what's going on within, to actually look in that mirror of our self-analysis and to examine where we are right now in terms of all the aspects of a human being, in terms of our thinking. What am I thinking now, and why? Why do I think in the ways that I do? Our feelings. What do we feel about certain people, certain things? The love and the hatred we have in our lives, and where does it come from? The envy, the conceit, the fear, the depression, all those internal states. What are they? Where do they come from? So that process of becoming aware of what's happening within is critical. When we look at our behaviors, then the external side, what am I doing to other people? What am I doing outside the home? What am I doing inside the home in terms of my actions? Those physical manifestations are also very important. But the root of all of this is to look, to reflect. And this is where Surah Rum, Surah 30, verse 8, is very clear and very strong about this. It says, أَوَلَمْ يَتَفَكَّرُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. Do they not reflect upon themselves? And this is really the essence of akhlaq, in terms of the key tool, your sword in this battle is self-analysis. And from that process of self-analysis, we can then apply it to a range of different dimensions in terms of our thinking, our feeling, our behavior, and our actions. All the 4 dimensions of being a human being.
And you touched on this. You mentioned the idea that a sword, and like the hadith itself, they were coming back from battle, and they were saying now you have to engage in a greater battle. So the idea here that we're getting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is a struggle taking place. There is a battle to take place. So when we look at the idea of akhlaq, or better traits, or perfecting ourselves, personal development, it seems as though, on paper it makes sense. Everyone wants to be nicer, everyone wants to be kinder, everyone wants to have more patience. Nobody wants to suffer from depression. Everyone wants to be the better person that they are, like you said, better today than they were yesterday. But again, the idea that there is a battle. Where is this battle taking place? Because if we're struggling to become better, why would that be a battle? Where is the battle taking place?
I think one of the fundamental problems we have is of language, where we translate jihad as being battle. It's not. It's much broader and deeper than that. Because the process of jihad is a process of striving. Sometimes we use the word struggle. Sometimes we use the word battle. But actually, when we think about it in those ways, we are pitching ourselves against ourselves. It's very unhelpful psychologically. But when we think about jihad as a striving, rather than necessarily as a struggling, we begin to appreciate some of the nuances, the subtleties of the Islamic message. Let's take some practical examples. When we think about some of the internal difficulties we may have, particularly nowadays in the difficult times we live in, often we have a sense of ourselves. Many young people are really struggling with their Muslim identity in the West because of all the negative publicity about what Islam and what Muslims are. And we need to really think about how do we counter that. And if we counter our inner self-perception in the language of a battle, then we're really setting ourselves against ourselves. So when we think about it as striving, how does it change? Well, if you think about something like striving, then you are accepting the reality as it is, but changing your reaction, your relationship, your interpretation of it. So let's take an example. Let's say we have particular views about ourselves. Let's take a simple example of a student struggling with their maths. Now, if this student says, look, I'm just rubbish at maths, and just keeps fighting maths and tries to avoid it, that's going to create internal conflict. But if we think about it as a process of striving, the first step is accepting it. So accepting where I am today. So accepting, yes, I do have difficulty with this part of maths. That process of accepting, rather than fighting it or struggling against it, that acceptance liberates us. Why? Because firstly, it allows us the freedom to look at things as they are, rather than pretending that they are not. Secondly, it then gives us the creativity, that faculty of creativity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His generosity has given us. Imagination and creativity is a grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the way we strive to improve ourselves. So in this example of a student struggling with maths, accepting step one, that there is a problem, and then step two, being creative about how that person can overcome these challenges. That's the striving. That's the jihad with that inner weakness with maths. So it is not about setting up confrontational battles with ourselves. In fact, when we look at the traditions of military skill and strategy, quite often when you are faced with a very powerful adversary, you don't go head to head. In the Chinese material, in the various martial arts, we have the idea of yin and yang. Yang being the powerful head-on energy, yin being the softer energy to deflect. So if you're confronting something that is very strong, if you attack it head-on, you're going to get crushed. And psychologically, that's what happens to ourselves. When we have a really strong negative sense about ourselves and we try and fight it, all we're doing is fueling it. And we end up damaging our own psychology. But if we take a yin approach, a softer approach of accepting the challenge and deflecting it, we can then stand unified within ourselves with all the different aspects of ourselves, standing in the ground of acceptance. And we see this akhlaq in the teachings of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, in various ways. One example that comes to mind, particularly in the current situation about what non-Muslims are saying about who the Prophet, peace be upon him, was and how he dealt with criticism. When we look at his history, we find that his akhlaq was such, his inner purification was such, that his external etiquette, his adab, the adab with which he interacted with people. Note the big distinction between external behavior, etiquette, and inner purification. We can have brilliant manners, but be internally corrupt. And likewise, if you really focus on the inner purification, then the external will come automatically. And we see that with the Holy Prophet. We have the example of the lady who used to throw rubbish upon his head every day when he walked past her house. And on the first occasion, when rubbish wasn't thrown, he was worried about this lady. And then when it happened again, he inquired about her. And he knocked on the door and he asked, "Are you okay?" And she asked, "Well, have you come to attack me today?" And he said, "No, I've come to ask how you are because you don't do what you usually do, and I was worried whether you're well." And it turned out she was very sick. And in that interaction that she had with the Holy Prophet, she began to appreciate what Islam actually is, rather than the propaganda that she had received that caused her to throw rubbish upon him. Why is this relevant for our discussion on akhlaq? Well, the reason being is that when we speak about jihad, when the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, did jihad with that lady, what did he do? First, there was an acceptance of the reality as it is. There is a person who has a particular view that causes her to throw rubbish upon his head every day. But there was a wider idea. He didn't respond with yang, with brute force against that. He responded with yin. He responded with gentleness and softness to accept this is her state and to show where compassion lies in dealing with this situation. And having a softer approach to dealing with it allowed her the space, the inner space, to realize where truth lay. We need to do that with that person inside us who throws rubbish upon our own heads every day. That inner sense of criticizing, wrongful criticizing. I don't mean constructive criticism that results in our improvement. I'm talking about that inner voice in our head that causes needless guilt, that causes rumination. Rumination is a word that psychologists use as one of the symptoms of people who either are suffering from depression or are candidates for suffering anxiety and depression. And rumination basically is about chewing over something that happened again and again and again. So when shaitan may have deceived us into doing something wrong in the past, he then uses this tool of rumination to keep us locked in that cycle that that's all we are, making us forget the holy verse of the Quran, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, from Surah 13, that we've created humanity in the best of molds, that our real destiny in terms of our heritage, spiritual heritage, is purification and perfection. And this process of rumination keeps us locked into thinking that that's all we are. So when we apply akhlaq to our own mental well-being, the first step is to accept where we are today. As I say, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step, but you have to begin with where you are. And that acceptance is the first step of the self-reflection that grounds the process of akhlaq. And the continuing steps are then about the compassion with which we deal with ourselves and with others, so that we may be able to manifest the true Islam that the Holy Prophet brought for us.
So we're going to have a specific show just on self-reflection, just how important a tool that actually is in our personal development, in this greater struggle, greater jihad. But before we get that, because this is the first show, we're looking at the introductory elements of this discussion. We're trying to understand what it is around us. Like you said, touching again on this self-reflection, looking within, looking at, for example, like you said, the acceptance of someone who, for example, has an issue with maths. To make it more relevant, for example, someone who has an issue with anger, to be able to look within and say, okay, this is my issue, this is my problem. So what I'm trying to get at here is the idea of, if we were to take a very general look at man, what are the elements within man? What is mankind made of? What is the internal, shall we say, the again, for use of the analogy, the battlefield? What is the plane that we're on? So that we then know how to begin this, whether it's yin, yang, or however we look to try and start this first step of this 1,000-step journey, if you like. What are we made of? What are those fundamental elements? Even if we were to look at them very simplistically, but just to be able to have that understanding that when we do look within, this is what we're trying to look at, or what we are looking at.
That is a question that philosophers have spent thousands of years trying to analyze. And if you look at Islamic philosophy, it has a rich tradition of this. And I don't want to address that question from a philosophical point of view, which is where it often manifests. I'd rather look at it from the point of view of akhlaq, which is a different perspective. And even within the akhlaq teachings, your question is so important and so fundamental that there are different angles to addressing that question. I would prefer to look at the perspective to your question presented by Imam Zain al-Abidin al-Islam, the fourth Imam, in his text on Dua Makarim al-Akhlaq, the supplication, the psalm of the perfection of human character, Makarim al-Akhlaq. Because in that dua, we have some answers to that question. Indeed, at the very beginning of that dua. So after salawat, which is the way these duas begin, quite rightly, so that in seeking Allah's blessing upon the Holy Prophet and his holy progeny, we then also are able to participate in that grace with the requests that follow. And if you look at the requests, the dimensions of the first verse addresses your question. And the Imam alayhi salam begins with وَبَلِّغْ بِإِيمَانِ أَكْمَلَ الْإِيمَانِ, and is seeking to Allah to cause his faith to reach the most perfect faith. And then the second dimension, وَجْعَلْ يَقِينِ أَفْضَلَ الْيَقِينِ, and to take my certainty to the best of certainty. So there's clearly a distinction in terms of who we are between the aspect of our faith, our iman, and the aspect of certainty, that there is a different dimension of a human being here. And then he continues, وَانْتَهِي بِنِيَّتِ إِلَىٰ أَحْسَنِ النِّيَّاتِ, to take my intention. So we bring in the mental dimension now. To take my intention to the best of intentions. And then we've got the fourth dimension, the more physical, behavioral aspect, which is وَبِعَمَلِي إِلَىٰ أَحْسَنِ الْأَعْمَالِ, and to take my actions to the best of actions. So the model of a human being that the Imam al-Islam presents in this dua is four-dimensional. It's faith, and then there's a spiritual dimension. So faith transcending the emotional, mental, and spiritual. And then there is a particularly spiritual dimension of yaqeen. Then we go to the purely mental dimension of niyyah, of our intention, our motivation. Why do we think in the way we think? Why do we do that which we do? And then we move on to the external, the actions. And that's the flow of being and action that we see in the akhlaq of Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam.
So to summarize very, very simply, the idea that you have a physical side and you have a spiritual side. That I think we can, without getting too philosophical, the idea that, we have the mental states where we make our intention, where we have our faith, and the idea that you reach certainty, all takes place within. And then the a'mal, where the physicality, or where that intention, where that mentality sort of, you could say, manifests physically in actions, in our adab, as we mentioned before the show, how our mannerisms, for example. So we reside as man, we reside in a physical and a spiritual, and this is ultimately, or one of the planes, you could say, that this struggle is to take place. I want to look at, in some of my research, and I'm not sure how much the dua itself touches upon this, but the idea that within this physical and spiritual realms, we have a tendencies, if you like. I'm not sure if tendencies is the right word, but we have tendencies. Maybe you could bring in fitrah here to a certain extent, but we have tendencies towards things that are, for example, godly on the one hand. So, for example, someone who has or behaves in a just manner, justice, we're naturally going to be preordained to be favourable of such a person, as opposed to someone who acts unjustly. Or the idea here ultimately is that we have a godly element to us, and I don't know if animalistic is the right word again, but the idea that we have a base nature. So we have within us desires, we have within us, again, these don't have to be within the context or confines of godly or ungodly or animalistic or anything like that, but the idea that we have natures within us that attract towards things that are higher and lower at the same time. Does the dua mention things like this? Is the fact that the imam praying in the dua and asking for this, is that an acknowledgement of the fact that you have a lower state and a higher state? If you could just elaborate on that at all.
That's a profound question, which has about 5 different dimensions to it. When you speak about animalistic and godly aspects, the way we've been created is that all our attributes are godly. in that even the most physical base desires and needs that we have actually have a spiritual aspect to it. And when we look at Kumel, for instance, Imam Ali alayhi salam talks about to strengthen all our physical limbs for his service. قَوِّيَ لَا خِدْمَتِكَ جَوَارِهِ. Strengthen all my limbs so that they may be of service to you. So that even the most basic aspects of what we do can actually become a form of service. So when we look at things from the point of view of akhlaq, we can accept all the attributes that we have as being in each of their own ways a form of dhikr, a form of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we look at some of the commentaries of the Makarim al-Akhlaq, we see this. Sayyid Madani Shiraz, forgive me, Sayyid Ali Khan, referred to as Madani Shirazi quite often, in his commentary on the Makarim al-Akhlaq and his analysis of the verse on niyyah, وَانْتَهِ بِنِيَّةِ لَأَحْسَنِ النِّيَّاتِ, says something quite remarkable that addresses this question, whereby he gives the example of how intention can transform ordinary things into the extraordinary. So that which we may think as animalistic can be transformed into dhikr, can be transformed into our connection with divinity itself. And the example he gives is eating. So if we are hungry and we need to fulfill our bodily function of satiating the hunger, if we just eat for that purpose, fine, we work at that level. But if we change our intention to eat so that we may be able to strengthen ourselves in his service, we transform the mundane into the sublime. And we have that power. So that when we think about the different aspects of ourselves, it's a mistake to think that, oh, that's a lesser aspect of myself that I can ignore. No, it's a part of who we are. It's a gift we've been given. And quite often, Shaitan uses those aspects of our physical needs, our desires, our various social aspects as, oh, these are base, these are negative. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us all of these faculties, all the physical aspects, as different manifestations of His grace. So we need to ask the question, how can I spiritualize the more basic aspects of who I am and what I do? So Sayyid Ali Khan is showing us one example of how just our eating practice can be transformed. He talks about perfume. He talks about many other aspects. He talks about the coming together of a husband and a wife. He talks about the enjoining of friends, the approach we take to our work. All of these different aspects can, at one level, be viewed as, oh, very basic, very animalistic. But when you look at it through the lens of akhlaq, they become opportunities of manifesting our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're invitations to transform that which is ordinary and boring in our lives, or that which takes us away from spiritual practice, to becoming a spiritual practice in and of itself.
So, is this one element of the struggle?
Yes.
So the
striving. The striving. You can think about it as a struggle from the point of view of struggling against the heedlessness. The real struggle is against our own mindlessness. When we think about taqwa, quite often taqwa is presented as being having fear of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't need us to fear Him. We are too insignificant to be able to fear. We are not even capable of that. Because really to be able to fear is to be outside of. But we are only through Him, because of Him, and with Him at any point. With that very breath with which we may defy Allah, we are manifesting His glory. When the atheist denies the existence of Allah, the voice with which he denies Allah is a dhikr in and of itself. But he doesn't understand that that's a dhikr. So when we, in our own actions, are heedless, that's where the struggle is. And this is why akhlaq is essentially about that knowledge within, that awareness within. And this is why the Holy Prophet said, Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbah. One who really knows himself knows his Lord. Because when we know the way we think and the way we act and why we do that and how they're all gifts of Allah, then everything becomes a dhikr. So the real jihad here, the real striving, is for mindfulness. And we are struggling against, if we want to use the word struggle, if we want to use the analogy of a battle, the real battle and the struggle is against heedlessness, mindlessness, doing things in a way that isn't conscious of who we are, what we're doing, and why we're doing it. That is the battleground.
Ahsan. And, in shows to come, we will look at specific elements of heedlessness. So, for example, the idea of corrupted intentions, or the idea of pride, or arrogance, or anger. We will have detailed shows specifically about these things. But if we can take a general look at a person, any individual who has not embarked on this greater struggle, someone who has not looked within, someone who is not cognizant or is ultimately heedless, what kind of traits does such a person have? And ultimately, do we have those traits? Does that mean we've not started the greater striving, greater struggle that the Prophet said to his companions that after the battle, now we need to start the greater jihad? What kind of traits does such a person have? Because, as we mentioned, it's not necessarily adab. You gave a very telling example of a politician. Not adab, that for the viewers once. What traits does such a person have or not have? Someone who has not looked within or has not embarked on this striving.
Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam, sallallahu alayhi, the sixth holy Imam, had a teaching for his students that at the end of each day to do an audit of all our actions and thoughts and behaviors for that day. And that's a really powerful practice to address this question, because if we find that we are progressing, then we know we are engaging with our akhlaq and our development, if progressing in our spiritual journey. But if when we do this exercise of accounting to ourselves, in preparation for one day having to account to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we find ourselves regressing, then we know actually we are in that state of heedlessness. But sometimes the external is different to the internal. So externally we may have brilliant manners, we may have great etiquette, and we see that all too often. One of the reasons why the population is losing confidence in their politicians is because they see that at the times of elections, there is lots of handshaking and lots of wonderful etiquette and manners and care and listening to people. But when there isn't a specific need, that may not be, those behaviors may not manifest in that way. So when we think about akhlaq, actually it's much deeper. You can think about it like an iceberg, whereby you may see the tip of the iceberg above the waterline. So you may see it as a person of beautiful values and ethics and character and etiquette. But if there isn't that deep, solid structure underlying it, supporting it in terms of character, then that's just a little item on the surface of the ocean that's easily tossed around. Whereas with a big, deep iceberg, there is a whole structure of inner development that is supporting what you see outside. There is a lot of work and building, self-building, that has happened that you don't see, that's beneath the waterline. So when we look at ourselves and we see whether we're progressing in our spiritual journey or whether we're regressing in our spiritual journey, that is the answer to your question. And we answer it for ourselves. And if we look at it from examples from history, the Holy Prophet, peace upon him, encountered a number of such people, well-meaning people. And in Mizan al-Hikmah and various other sources, it's narrated that a sincere person who was at the beginning of his spiritual journey came to the Holy Prophet and said, I want to improve my iman, my faith. How do I do that? And the response of the Holy Prophet was, he said, improve your akhlaq so that you may complete your iman. So having this series that you're starting on akhlaq is central to the process of having faith and completing our faith. That is how important the Holy Prophet, peace upon him, and his holy progeny placed this work. But the reason why it's given such great reward is because it's difficult. When the word jihad is used, that idea of striving, is because it's hard. It is incredibly difficult. If we try it now, as a practical exercise right now, and we think about how we are thinking about ourselves, just how do I view myself right now? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What are the things I want to improve about myself? What are the things that I am good at, alhamdulillah, that I want to do better? That kind of inner conversation is very difficult, and we are easily distracted. We may be enticed to change the channel on the TV and switch to something that distracts us, that is easier, that is lighter, that is less effort. And it's that effort that is required to engage in this self-reflection, to engage in the process of looking within. That's where the analogy of jihad really comes in, because it's hard. And the reason why the reward is so great, we are familiar with the hadith that an hour of reflection is worth more than 70 years of worship. Well, why? There must be something incredibly powerful and difficult about sustained reflection. And its transformative power must be so great as to be equivalent to a lifetime of worship. That's the opportunity. That's the invitation that we have in continuing and embarking upon, where necessary, the journey of personal development.
Hassan, this reminds me of a verse that I came across. You should see it on your screens now, where the Quran describes this as an upward climb or an upward struggle. And then it gives certain examples, the idea of, have you given food while you were hungry? So again, this idea of battling, for example, I keep using the word battle, but I'm cognizant of the idea that it's a struggle or a striving. But this internal struggle against, again, not necessarily ourselves, or not necessarily our base desires as such, but the idea that we're trying to develop into better beings or better versions of ourselves. The idea that, okay, we reflect and we look forward. Again, I want to bring it back once again to the idea of examples, like day-to-day examples, things that the viewers can look at and say, I recognize that, potentially. Things that we aim to look at further in coming episodes. But the idea, for example, someone who has not accepted, or the idea of taqwa, for example, that godlessness or that cognizance of God within your everyday, within all your actions. So someone who has not embarked on this through heedlessness, the idea of, for example, depression, or constantly worrying what's going to happen next, or will I be like financial issues. Of course, these are all tests from God for us to realize that He has His hand in all of these issues. But just day-to-day examples that we may look at and say, I recognize that within ourselves. Maybe lying, the idea of trying to deflect the truth so that we make ourselves look a certain way. It could be on, for example, ujb, as we've discussed previously. various sort of small examples or day-to-day examples that highlight the idea of, or an individual. This could be, for example, Muslim, non-Muslim, anyone, just an individual who has not taken that effort or has not begun that effort of looking within, or the greater jihad or the greater struggle. Because I think with those tangible examples, we are then able to see those elements within ourselves, because we're all on this journey, right? So just ultimately, anything sort of tangible that we can look at on a day-to-day basis, that we may have to say that, okay, this actually shows that, you know, I have work to do, or I have not even started this idea of looking within or having that God consciousness.
It's a really important point. When we look at the teachings, the two things we see occurring repeatedly is the idea of how you walk along this path. And one of those processes is to tread lightly, is to walk with compassion, so that we may be compassionate to ourselves. And through that practice, we can then be compassionate to others. Compassionate does not mean lazy. It does not mean allowing ourselves to do bad things repeatedly. That's not compassion. That's a form of self-abuse, where we don't sort ourselves out. If, let's say, you know, someone is suffering from substance abuse, you know, a compassionate approach to oneself is not to say, oh, we'll just continue taking the drugs or whatever. A compassionate approach is to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing, and then to gently but carefully find a way out. So to give an example, you spoke about depression. In these days, for many reasons, if we look at different surveys, it shows that about 1 in 5 adults in the UK suffers from depression. Experts estimate that the actual number may be higher because men tend to underreport depression. And when we have depression, we often find ourselves as being like at the bottom of the well, a dark well. And many different things can put us there. Family disputes, financial difficulties, health difficulties, anything that throws us off the course that we were on. And we lose that confidence, that connection with Allah we may have had. When we're at the bottom of that well, in the darkness of that well, the first thing we need to do is compassionately to acknowledge to ourselves, this is what's happening now, not to deny it. And when we acknowledge to ourselves what has happened, how it has happened, we then build ourselves up to be able to stand up at the bottom of that well. And we give ourselves the confidence to be able to look for a ladder in that well and to take one step at a time. And these episodes in our lives can be so difficult that that ladder can be greasy. So you may start to climb out of the well of depression. You may start to rebuild a relationship with a loved one that broke down. And because of the grease on that ladder, you may fall back down again to the bottom of the well and land in a heap, breaking more bones, because there may be subsequent rows with that family member. There may be subsequent financial difficulties. You may have got into the well because you lost your job. A little bit of money came in, then that went as well. So you're back at the bottom. Health may have become very bad. You may have had a little recovery, then a relapse. The process is never linear, a straight line. It's always up and down. But what stays with us is our relationship to Allah, even though we may not be able to feel it at the bottom of the well. And what's critical at that point is not to be a hypocrite. So that if we do not feel like worshipping in the way we would want to, it's sometimes better not to. I'm not talking about the things that are wajib, that are obligatory, but the things that are optional. And we get this from Nahj Balagha, from the master of spirituality. Imam Ali alayhi salam says that there are cases where a sin that makes you sorrowful and seek forgiveness from Allah is better than a good deed that gives you ujb, that gives you self-admiration, that gives you conceit. So sometimes when we're at the bottom of that well, because of things we may have done to ourselves or to other people, that actually can be a rahmah, can be a grace. Because from that process, we glean insights into ourselves and the world around us and how we may be able to rebuild. So the key aspect to the point you raised is how we walk along the journey of akhlaq. And that is essentially about compassion. And this is why the one who brought us akhlaq, the Holy Prophet, is referred to as rahmatul lil alameen, as a blessing, as a grace, as a compassion upon the world. It is not by coincidence that the rahmatul lil alameen said, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِيُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ, that the one who was the blessing upon the worlds said that the reason why he was sent was the perfection of human character. The two go together. So we cannot seriously engage upon the path of Jihadul Akbar, the greatest jihad, the striving for self-purification, and throw away the teaching that came with it, the map of compassion. And it begins with accepting where we are, not trying to fight it and deny the reality of it. So if, as a practical example, we have difficulty saying our prayers, let's say, in the middle of summer, when reciting Salatul Fajr, the morning prayers, is difficult. We don't need to deny it to ourselves and start making excuses that, oh, I'm too busy, the sun rises too early, and start fighting it logically. Sometimes we abuse our mental faculties that God gives us to create webs of complexity that we hide behind and excuses. Let's cut through that with the sword of self-awareness and realize that actually maybe we can go to sleep a little earlier to be able to stand a chance of waking up earlier. Maybe it may be better to wake up a lot earlier and recite Fajr at the time it was supposed to be recited so that there is then still time to go back to sleep. Now, okay, that's one example. There may be more serious examples with regard to family relations, where sometimes we may need to take stock, and that process of taking stock requires space. It may be a process of understanding the sins we commit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and understanding why we do that, and seeking His help to be able to climb out. And what I mean by that is, when, for example, Dua Makarim al-Akhlaq talks about وَانْتَهِ بِنِيَّتِي إِلَىٰ أَحْسَنِ النِّيَّاتِ, take my intention to the best of intentions, what that means is that good intention is a continuum, it's like a volume dial. It goes up and up. So if we are not ready to behave in the way we really want to, let us have the prayer before the prayer. As St. Augustine, one of the great Christian saints, is what is attributed to have said, saying, God, make me chaste, but not just yet. It was a very beautiful example of where that human being was at that time. So it was the prayer before the prayer, saying, oh Allah, I'm not ready to do that, to be that, but help me where I am now. And it's that self-understanding of where we are now with compassion to ourselves. That's what creates the inner space to be compassionate to others. If we are tyrants upon other people, we may want to think about where that comes from. Because quite often, the tyranny we invoke upon other people is a reflection of the tyranny we impose upon ourselves. Hence, in du'as, we have the phrase, ظَلَمْتُ nafsi, that I have been a tyrant upon myself. So when you speak about the journey, the key mode in which we walk has to be compassion. It is not by coincidence that nearly every verse that nearly every chapter of the Holy Quran, with just one exception, begins with the verse Bismillah, in the name of Allah, Ar-Rahman, the most compassionate, Ar-Rahim, the most merciful. And if we begin each day's journey of akhlaq as a new beginning, and we begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, if we begin our work, if we begin our babysitting, if we begin our physical workout, our exercises with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, it transforms the mundane activity into sublime remembrance of Allah. What we may call animalistic aspects of ourselves change into being a celebration of the divine faculty that God has given us to remember Him in this particular way, in this particular physical way, in this particular emotional way, in this particular mental way. All of it then becomes part of the vehicle that we're in, striving along the path of proximity to Allah.
Ahsan.
Qurbatan ilallah.
Sorry, Ahsan, thank you very much. We've come to the end of the show. It has moved so fast. We've touched on so many different topics. I think one thing that we really want to take into next week's episode is this idea of dhalamtu nafsi. Again, the idea of introspection, the idea that it starts with looking within. This whole journey begins as we look within, to look at the plane where we're at, to look at our tendencies, our characteristics, and then to make the move forward. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for taking the time once again. Join us again next week where we'll continue this discussion. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ahlul Bayt TV, the holy household for every